I'm Corsten. I'm from RWTH Aachen University, and on behalf of my fellow researchers, Christian Cherek, Thorsten and Borchers, I'm presenting HaptiCase, back-of-device tactile landmarks for eyes-free absolute indirect touch. Well, you're probably all familiar with typical smartphone interactions. So you have an on-screen target that you want to tap, and how do you do this? Well, you look at the smartphone at the display, you look at the target, and you watch your finger actually approaching that target in order to hit it. There are also situations in which you have the input and the output separated. So for example, in mirrored applications. Here's a game, for example. You project it onto a TV, for example, because you want to share it with other people. You want a better gaming experience. You still are using the smartphone for input, but now the output and your focus is actually somewhere else, namely at the distant screen. And the problem that you have here is that basically now you can't watch your finger while you're doing the input until you look back and forth. So let's have a look at how typical touch interaction is modeled here from a device perspective. Basically, we have two states. First of all, when our finger is not in contact with a touch screen, we're out of range. Until then, we touch down, we basically end up in state 1, and the finger is tracked. And then when we release the finger, we go basically back to state 0. From a user's perspective, there's a little bit more going on here. So let's split it up. Basically have two states here. One that I call holding the device. So still when I'm holding the device, my finger is out of range. But then the user actually wants to tap. And that is when we move on to a state that I call visual targeting. Because now I'm watching my finger approaching the target. And then when I'm close to the target, I then actually tap down and end up again in state 1. And finally, when I release my finger, I'm back to holding the device. Which is okay, like in the situation that we see above, but when we now have mirrored applications and our focus is at the distant screen, so we don't look at the touch screen, it becomes a little difficult. I might, for example, miss a target, or I might accidentally hit another target, and that's for tapping really bad. So here's our solution that we call HaptiCase. This is a typical situation, what it looks like. We have a distant screen, we have an application there, for example, lots of on-screen buttons. And I'm using my smartphone as an absolute touch input device in typical landscape mode. Note how the fingers are positioned here. So our thumbs are actually resting above the touch screen, and our forefingers are resting at the back of the device. Let's imagine now I want to tap the white button with the radio logo on it, more to the right-hand side. So how can I do this in an eyes-free situation? Because I'm only looking at the distant screen, but not at my phone. So what we did is we actually augmented the back of the phone with TechTile Guidance. So here you can see, for example, this white rectangle. It's a raised frame that you can feel with your forefingers that are resting at the back. And for further guidance, we added even more tactile dots here that are also raised that the user can feel. So how do I now perform a touch? Because the back of the device is totally passive. We're not using any electronic components here. So that's what you can see here in the video. The user is now moving the finger at the back to find a touch position of interest. And what you then simply do is you pinch your thumb to the forefinger at the back. And this is actually something that we can do eyes-free without looking. So we can fix our eyes at the distant screen and still perform the touching in this absolute indirect touch mode. So from the interaction perspective, what has changed now? We still have our holding device state, and we are out of range when we're not touching the screen. And now when the user wants to tap, we can't really use visual targeting. Well, we're looking at the target at the distant screen, but we can't watch the finger anymore. So what we're using is now the tactile guidance at the back of the device, and this is something that I call tactile targeting. So instead of simply touching with our forefingers, what we now do to communicate a touch to the touch screen, we simply pinch the thumb, and then we end up again in state 1. We are in tracking until I release my finger. I go back to holding the device. Because then when I want to tap again, I basically have to come from holding the device. So what we now can, what we contributed basically in our paper is, first of all, this interaction concept, the interaction concept behind HaptiCase or tactile targeting. And the second thing, of course, we needed to evaluate this. So we evaluated tactile targeting regarding accuracy for eyes-free tapping task and also the time that users need to perform a tap. And HaptiCase has several benefits. Well, obviously, it improves eyes-free tapping, but furthermore, it is also low cost. So you just need a protection case that you can, for example, manufacture with a laser cutter or buy it in the shop. There are no electronic components involved here. Furthermore, it is compatible with existing software, so we just have to turn on screen mirroring and can use HaptiCase right off. And also the regular use of the smartphone is unaffected, so we do not add something to the touchscreen. We can still do smooth gesturing, and when we don't need it, we simply do not interact with HaptiCase. So HaptiCase basically uses 4 different areas or combines it. First of all, we have absolute indirect touch here. So we are assuming that the aspect ratio of the input device and output device are the same, and we're using an absolute mapping to communicate our input to the distance screen. And when we look at the back of the device, we have basically, of course, back of device interaction. And prior to performing our touch, we gain tactile feedback, so we have this a priori feedback. And using tactile patterns for haptic discrimination is also not new. It's basically borrowed from industrial design. So let's have a look at what kind of tactile patterns we actually had in mind for HaptiCase. So the simplest idea that you could think of is just a raised frame that has the same aspect ratio, dimension, bounce, and position of the touchscreen that is at the front. Second, we added more tactile landmarks within that frame in the form of dots on a pattern of 3x5 dots. We also increased the resolution by adding more dots in between 2 adjacent dots. And we also looked at continuous lines, where basically here, each crossing of a line is the same position as a dot in the dots design. And of course, for comparison, we also had a completely flat back, which we call the base condition. So we manufactured these cases in a laser cutter and put them on a protection case. So we used acrylic sheets just engraved such that only the tactile landmarks were sticking out here. We had 2 research questions now regarding evaluation. So the first one is, does HaptiCase actually improve IS3 typing accuracy? And we have 3 hypotheses here. First of all, HaptiCase is more accurate than the base condition. Second, high-resolution designs, that means adding more tactile landmarks, improves tapping accuracy over having fewer landmarks. And the third one is that targets that are located around the border are more accurately to hit compared to targets more located at the center. This is our apparatus for testing. So we had a distance screen, and in order to match the aspect ratio, we had this paper cutout there. And the user had to put his hands, while holding the smartphone, under this cardboard cutout. That's what it looks from the side, so that he could not watch his or her fingers on the touch screen. Note that we used a visual outline here on the screen, and that is actually the position of the outermost tactile landmarks within that frame. That is because we started putting the landmarks from the very center of the back, and the distance between adjacent dots is the same, but it's not the same to the frame here in this case. So we used 6 different case designs, and we had 28 different targets that were displayed on the screen. They were 50 millimeters in width and could be classified within 3 different groups. So we had key targets at very prominent positions, we had border targets around the border, and targets located towards the middle. And please note that we used very generic patterns. So it can happen that a touch point is actually located on such a tactile landmark, but there are also targets that are located somewhere else between landmarks, for example. We measured the error, which is basically the offset from the user's touch to the target that is shown on the screen, and the time that the users needed to perform the touches. So let's have a look at the results. First of all, error by case. What we can see here is that using a dots design, HaptiCase significantly improved the tapping accuracy. So we moved from about like 6.7 millimeters to down from originally like 7.3 millimeters. And it's also significantly compared to the high-resolution lines design. And that is because people stated that having too much tactile information is not helpful anymore. So at some point, it actually breaks down. What we should also note is that within the dots designs or within the 2 lines designs, we have no significant difference, basically telling us that increasing the resolution does not improve tapping accuracy. We also look at the different target groups, and what we can see here basically is that the further we move away from the border towards the center, the more difficult it becomes to hit the targets. Still, using the dots design, we are more significant, we're significantly better compared to the base condition. Only for the 3x5 base condition for middle targets, the difference is not significant, but we could detect at least a trend, so the p-value is around 6%. Looking at the time, well, HaptiCase can actually not compete with having no tactile landmarks. So that means tactile targeting comes at the cost of time. For example, if you look at the 3 times 5 dots design, it's about 400 milliseconds per tap in addition to the traditional base design where we have no tactile guidance at all in an ice-free tapping condition. So in summary, what we could say is that, yes, our dot lens marks improved the tapping accuracy. Secondly, we found no difference in the 2 resolutions. And middle targets were actually hit the least accurately, and border targets were hit the most accurately. But all that comes at a time accuracy trade-off. So we gain accuracy, but it takes more time. In the second question, we wanted to compare tactile targeting to visual targeting and see how they relate to each other. And for visual targeting here, what we allowed the user was to look at the empty or blank screen of the smartphone so they could watch the finger, but the target was only displayed at the distant screen. We had 2 hypotheses here. First of all, visual targeting is more accurate and faster compared to tactile targeting. And in the second, when we combine targeting in the visual and the tactile mode, the added tactile targeting does not really bring any more benefit. Here are the 3 conditions. First of all, visual targeting. So we have a flat back and a blank touchscreen. In the tactile and visual combination, we have our 3 times 5 dots design and a blank touchscreen. And in the tactile targeting, that's basically the same as in the first study. We have a tactile design with 3 times 5 dots. So we measured again the error and the offset, basically the same setup as in study 1, except in this case we also removed the visual outline. So looking at the error by targeting, we can see that visual targeting actually outperforms tactile targeting, and that difference is significant. But what we can also see is that when we combine the 2, visual and tactile, it is a little bit less accurate, but the difference is not significant. Furthermore, when we look at the time, we can see that visual targeting is much faster compared to tactile targeting. And again, when we combine the 2, well, it's a little bit slower, but the difference is not significant. So what we can take away from this is basically that the dominant factor here is the visual targeting that people use. So when they can look at the blank touchscreen, when they are willing to do that, that's actually better in this case. So in summary, we can say that visual targeting was more accurate and was faster compared to tactile targeting, and adding tactile targeting on top does not improve any further. So what are now the implications for us? So we looked at how do we have to design the target sizes in a tactile targeting task such that we can have a good accuracy, and we base that on the 99% confidence intervals. So for key targets, they should be at least 12.6 millimeters in width. For targets that are located at the border, but at the lower border, they should be 13.8 millimeters. And interestingly, what we found out is that targets located at the top, they should be larger. And that was because it was difficult for people to stretch their thumbs to these positions. Versus actually for the middle targets, they should be at least 17.5 millimeters in width. So what we can say here is that we save about 14% in target size compared to when we have ice-free tapping without tactile targeting. And that is now for the worst case scenario here. However, this comes at the cost of about 400 milliseconds per tap that people need to perform in addition. So what are the limitations of HaptiCase? First of all, the effect is not that big. However, we hope to improve that with different designs. Tactile targeting is also not suitable for fast tapping games, for example, because of the added time that we need to perform a tap. And third, we only tested 1 device size, an iPhone 5S in this case. However, in future work, we would like to look at different device sizes like tablets and phablets, and we also want to experiment with different patterns. So, for example, mixing lines, dots, or different designs in one design, and also using asymmetric patterns in order to improve the targeting accuracy for middle targets. And our overall vision is basically to create a dynamic HaptiCase that only raises those dots relevant to the UI that is shown on the distant screen. And with this, I'd like to conclude my talk. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Hi, I'm Sean from Rowley. As well as remote displays, have you considered testing with blind participants?
Not with real blind participants, no, we did not.
But have you considered, like, it might be a good future direction?
Well, the thing is that what we could imagine is that for simple interfaces that you have somehow in your mind, like you might know imaginary interfaces where you have a very simple design like the home screen and you roughly know where certain targets are located, we could consider that this could work. Because in our setup, what we tested, well, we have a distance screen where we can see the targets. For a blind person, he would not be able to see them, so he would at least have to know the layout of the targets that he has in mind, basically.
Hi, I'm Beryl Plummer, University of Auckland. Yesterday there was a talk where they concluded that targets in the middle of the screen were much harder to get than, were easier to get than those on the edge. Mm-hmm. So effectively the opposite result to you, but of course without the tactile dots. It seems like this is probably an area that's kind of interesting to tease out a bit more. What do you think? Did you see that yesterday?
I didn't see that talk,
Yeah.
but what I can say is that like last year at CHI there was a comparison on absolute indirect touch tasks where also people had to perform tapping tasks on, and then sometimes they could look at the blank screen of the input device and sometimes they couldn't. And what they found out is basically the same. The targets that are towards the middle led to the highest error, except for the center itself, which was for ours here at the key position. So that is easy to hit, the absolute center. But if you're close to the center, it becomes more difficult. And also for HaptiCase, what we think the reason could be is that people feel that these tactile dots are guiding them a little bit like to the absolute center, although the target is like slightly off. So
yeah, having a look at the results from yesterday and kind of putting it together, I think you might find some interesting things of whether it's edge or center and how things work together. And the other thing is the potential for visually impaired, because the interaction for visually impaired on phones is pretty tap and swipe intensive at the moment. Have you looked at that or not?
So for visual impaired, not. So as I said before, what we could imagine is that when you have a certain layout in mind as the visually impaired person, like a typical screen like the home screen, let's say the dock on your iPhone, for example, where you roughly know where certain targets are positioned, we think that this could actually work, but it's something that we have to actually test and evaluate, of course. Yeah.
Thanks. Good talk.
Thank you.
Mid targets showed the least accuracy, and you just said that the center dot is a good reference. So what if we put some reference dots near midpoint, among midpoints?
Yeah, that's actually where we want to go. So here we used exactly the same tactile landmarks for any position that we had here. And what we like to do is to experiment with different designs of tactile landmarks. For example, as you know from a phone layout, for example, where you have like this small dot on number 5, but you don't have dots somewhere else. So we could think that at prominent positions, for example, we could have different landmarks compared to other positions, and that could hopefully improve, like tell the user, okay, now you're at the center, and if I take the other landmark, it feels different, so now you're not at the center anymore, but very close to it, for example.
Thank you.
Hi, Alex from the University of Washington. So great talk, first of all. One thing that you're assuming in this work is that the point that you're touching on the back is the same point you're going to be touching on the front, and I think that's a safe assumption for sure. But I noticed that I have like a really thick phone case, and of course I don't have the touch points here, but the point I'm touching on the front when I was trying to do it while you're doing your talk were a couple of millimeters off. So I was wondering if you saw that effect, if you have any comments on it, because you talked about different phone sizes, but are you looking at depth, thickness as well?
Yeah, so what we are going to investigate is two things. So we observed something, or people have, told us there is something that we call the pinch offset effect. And there are two things that we think this is dependent on. First of all, the tilt of your phone. So if you tilt it further, your pinching is more off. What we observed, however, in our study is that the angle is kind of limited that they use. So we didn't restrict them in using a certain angle, but it was roughly like 5 degrees within that range that it varied. And the second thing that you mentioned is that changing the thickness of the phone could also impact and increase the offset. But this is something that we want to test after on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Not yet, but that's actually a good idea that we should then include basically when we experiment with different mixtures of patterns. So even like looking at the frame itself to, for example, have like a curved edge at one thing, and then you know basically, oh, that's actually the bottom of where the home button is, for example. Yeah, that's a good idea.